Welcome to our ARUP Institute for Learning video presentation entitled Laboratory Results Beyond Patient Testing, presented by Cheryl Vincent. Cheryl has been involved in employee and leadership training at ARUP for the past 17 years. She is part of the organizational and leadership development team in the Human Services Division at ARUP Laboratories, where she is currently involved in training and coaching for supervisors, managers, and other employees interested in pursuing leadership opportunities. In addition, Cheryl is involved with employee engagement and currently leading ARUP's performance management team to review and update our processes to eventually move to an electronic performance management system. Cheryl graduated with a BS in Business from Utah State University and received her MBA from Westminster College with an emphasis in organizational development. I'll now turn our video lecture over to Cheryl.
Well, good afternoon. So the description of our session today is clinical laboratory scientists are trained to perform laboratory tests and to troubleshoot and validate the results of those tests which contribute to a patient's medical diagnosis. During this presentation, we want to compare the steps involved in pre-analytical, analytical, and post-analytical laboratory testing to those same phases in developing our leaders in the clinical laboratory. So let's go ahead and start with the specifics of our pre-analytical phase of laboratory testing. The 3 steps, and there could be more detailed, this is fairly brief, but we collect, handle, and process patient specimens. More specifically, phlebotomists verify that they have the correct patient before they even draw the specimens. They verify they have the correct collection tubes, and they have the patient verify that the labels placed on the specimens have the correct patient information. Handling, of course, is critical to accurate laboratory results. Specimens are transported to the laboratory in a timely manner at the correct temperature, and in some cases we make sure they're protected from light. We also protect specimens so they don't leak or break. And for clients of ARUP, our website has very detailed instructions as far as what clients need to do for collecting and handling different specimen types so that we ensure accurate test results. The third part, processing, involves additional verification of the patient and specimen information. Although collected and transported correctly, are the specimens still at the correct temperature? Has the correct specimen been collected for the test or tests that we've requested or that you've requested? And is all of the pertinent patient information included, such as the name, collection date, and time? As I mentioned, this is a fairly brief overview of that pre-analytical phase, but the key points are that we manage the collection, handling, and processing in this part of the phase. So how do we convert that over to developing our leaders? The pre-analytical phase of leadership development is assessing the individual just like we would assess specimens in preparation for testing. We want to determine what are the functions and skills expected from a new supervisor or manager. Which of those skills does the supervisor already have, and which skills can be taught to a new supervisor or manager? So, what is development? We talk about leadership development and leader development. It's to bring out the capabilities or possibilities of, to bring to a more advanced or effective state, to cause to grow or expand. The Center for Creative Leadership actually makes a distinction between leader development and leadership development in their handbook. They define leader development as the expansion of a person's capacity to be effective in leadership roles and processes. This includes self-management, social skills, work facilitation capabilities. On the other hand, leadership development, it's up to the organization. It's the expansion of the organization's capacity to enact the basic leadership tasks needed for collective work, such as setting direction, creating alignment, and maintaining commitment. So we mentioned that a supervisor has certain functions and skills. Let's first take a look at the functions of a leader. So we have planning, organizing, staffing, leading, and controlling. When we think of planning, it's setting goals and determining how to meet them. Those are goals for the individual staff members, perhaps, goals for the department, strategic planning. Organizing is setting up the group, allocating resources, and assigning work to achieve those goals. Staffing is identifying, hiring, and developing the necessary number and quality of employees. Leading is influencing people to act or perhaps not act in a certain way. Controlling is probably different than it sounds. It's about monitoring performance of the department, performance of individuals, and then making those needed corrections. It's also about controlling expenses and being fiscally responsible. So those are the functions, those are the things that they actually do. We also expect that people going into a leadership role have certain skills. Those skills can be divided into 4 different areas: technical skills, human relations skills, conceptual skills, and decision-making skills. Technical skills are obviously that specialized knowledge and expertise. For us in healthcare and in the laboratory industry, it's that expertise and knowledge. Could be the same for anyone in any industry, but they still have specialized knowledge and expertise. Human relations skills are the skills required to work effectively with other people. It includes the ability to communicate, motivate, and understand people. And if you understand people, you're probably further ahead than I am. Conceptual skills involve the ability to see the relationship, the parts to the whole, and to one another. In other words, a supervisor should be in charge of the big picture. Decision-making skills, kind of self-explanatory, but involves being able to analyze information and be able to reach good decisions. Someone with strong decision-making skills can think objectively and creatively. And as we go into not only affordable health care, but trying to cut costs, we need people to be creative as they manage their laboratories. As we look at these skills, they may vary in the amount that they are used depending on the level of leadership. And so, for example, technical skills. You can see that the supervisor, it requires a greater amount of technical skill that is used on a more regular basis. Our middle managers and top managers, they still have those technical skills, but they're probably not used on a daily basis. Our supervisors are available. They are the ones that are going to jump in if we need help on the bench. And so they always need to be competent and have those skills ready to go. When we look at human relations skills, really it doesn't matter at what level you are in the organization. Human relations skills are important. Human relations skills are important whether you're a leader or simply an individual contributor. It can make or break the success of a department. How those human relations skills are used may vary depending on the level of the leader. A supervisor may be dealing with personality conflicts or, certain things that way. If those situations aren't resolved by the supervisor and they get escalated, it will go to a middle manager, perhaps even getting escalated to a top manager. And at the top level of management, those human relations skills, is to share a lot of very, not necessarily global messages, but corporate messages. And so a lot of that information they need to be able to say, communicate what things are going to be like and why. Conceptual skills. Again, It's used at all levels of leadership. But a supervisor is much more focused on just their department. They may know how it works within a smaller division, and they know that they need to negotiate for different types of resources and so forth. But then middle managers and top managers, those conceptual skills become even more important. They're not only looking at their own department, but they're looking at the organization as a whole, and how do the parts relate to the whole and to each other. Decision-making skills, again, used at all levels. Typically, the decisions that are made at the various levels, those vary. So the decisions that a supervisor is making, they affect the department, but not necessarily the whole organization. When you're at the top level, those decisions that you make impact the entire organization. The Gallup organization, and I suspect you've at least heard of the Gallup organization, they do employee surveys and organizational surveys and so forth. And they've published lots of books. And I want to mention two here. Marcus Buckingham is the author on both of these books with a different co-author on each. But we have first Break All the Rules, and then Now Discover Your Strengths. First Break All the Rules discusses traditional management from the past. Those of us who've maybe been around the workplace for a while, we realize that there was a time when, it was a focus on the weaknesses of an individual. And these are the things that you have to fix. So we pointed out those negative things and expected people to make changes there. The second book, Now Discover Your Strengths, the importance of this book is it suggests a shift in thinking. We now want managers and supervisors to identify the strengths of staff members and capitalize on them. What can they do to contribute to the department and the organization utilizing those strengths? So let me ask you, what's one of the decisions that you've already made today? Was it maybe which way to drive to work, what to have for breakfast, where do I clock in, some of those simple decisions? How much did you think about those? Like me, probably not much. Sometimes we get in the car, whether it's to work or to home, and before we know it, we've reached our destination and we're thinking, wow, how did I get here? So we have a lot of small decisions that we make every day. And in the first book, Marcus Buckingham shares some facts on brain science. He explains that we make thousands of tiny decisions every day, but we're unable to intellectualize every one of those decisions, and so we react instinctively. Our brain does what nature does and follows the path of least resistance. Like a stream in the woods that encounters a blockage, the water finds the path of least resistance. Our brain does the same. So what he shares in his book about brain science is that at 42 days gestation, our first neuron is created. And every second for the next 120 days, 9,500 neurons are created. At 7 months gestation, those neurons start connecting through axons. We're born. By 3 years of age, 100 billion neurons have formed 15,000 connections each. And by the time we're 15, already many of those synaptic connections have been lost. It's our genetic inheritance, early childhood experiences that determine smoother pathways. So what happens is all those connections that take place, what happens is those are used, some of those are used over and over, and they become like a well-traveled road. And that's where our brain starts to follow the path of least resistance. So as those connections are made and those that are not used, obviously those are the ones that are lost. But those that are used by way of genetic inheritance or our experiences early on, those are the ones that become well-traveled and smoother pathways. In this book, there's a few definitions to add to this brain science. And he talks about talents. You may have your own definition of a talent, but in this case, he's defining it as natural recurring patterns of thought, feeling, or behavior. So those things that become well-traveled. Those talents then become strengths through consistent, near-perfect performance over and over again. He talks about skills. The skills are the steps to an activity or how to do something. So these are things that we can be taught, we can learn. In addition, we have knowledge, which are facts and lessons that also, like I say, are learned. These definitions and this brain science tie in to the assessment called the Strengths Finder Assessment. And you may have heard of that. That particular assessment, the individual goes through a process to identify 20 strengths that they have. So being able to look at what those strengths are for an individual and being able to capitalize on them. Again, this is a shift in thinking. Rather than focusing on our weaknesses, we want to look towards those strengths. There are other assessments that we can do, and I'll come back to a couple of the strengths listed in that particular assessment. There's personality assessments. We find out things about different individuals and people we work with. 360-degree assessments that perhaps you've either been a part of by being the one doing the assessment, or perhaps you have rated someone else. Assessments can be even less formal than that. They can be, as we're determining in this pre-analytical phase, what's the motivation behind someone to want to be in a leadership position. Here are some questions that we can ask. Do you consider yourself a highly ambitious person? You sincerely like people and have patience with them? Could you assume the responsibility of decision making? Would you enjoy learning about human behavior? Would you be happier with more responsibility? Would you rather work with problems involving human relationships than with, say, mechanical, computational, creative, clerical, or other types of problems? And do you desire an opportunity to demonstrate your leadership ability? So again, those assessments, as we go through this phase of determining their motivation and what skills they have, they can be formal or informal. As we look to people in leadership positions, a piece of advice that Marcus Buckingham would give us, and this is an article that he published in the March 2005 Harvard Business Review. And he talks about the distinction between being an average manager and a great manager. So as we define these expectations, we can talk through this with potential leaders. So what he says is average managers, they play checkers. Now, I don't mean literally. We don't sit in the office playing checkers. But as we look around at the staff members that we have and deciding where to place them, what assignments to give them, it's very cut and dry as far as with checkers, you move one space forward or one space to the side. It's very limited in how you utilize your staff. Where great managers play chess. And they look at their staff members and to determine where they should go, what assignments they should take. Maybe it's not just one step forward, like the pawn. Maybe it's like a knight, and they kind of go in an L shape, and they decide to put an individual over here. So it's a great skill to be able to look at staff and kind of strategically place people in the right positions. It's very common for us to hire individual contributors that have the best technical knowledge as a leader or supervisor. And it's important to remember that although that's an important skill, It's not the only skill. So getting back to our functions and skills and strengths and all of that, their skills are things that can be learned, where our strengths and talents are things that have come, that are inherent to us. Those are those in the brain science, those well-traveled pathways. Here's some example strengths: empathy, achievement, adaptability, developer, harmony. Let's say I have the strength of empathy. If I don't have the strength of empathy, I can probably work on it, but that may not be as simple to develop as I can learn how to manage budgets and handle disciplinary actions with my employees. Empathy is a strength that has been developed through, as we said, genetic inheritance and our early childhood experiences. It's a well-traveled road. Those synaptic connections are fluid and routine. Empathy becomes one of those decisions that we don't even think about, like driving to work, when it's actually one of our strengths. And there's a whole list. Feel free to check out the Strengths Finder assessment and all of that. It's a book that you can purchase, and these other books are very good. It even goes into a third book, Strengths-Based Leadership, and how you can apply some of those things in your leadership. So in summary, for our leader development or leadership results, in that pre-analytical phase, we define the expectations, what we expect them to do. We assess their skills and knowledge, and we assess their motivation to supervise. If it's only the title and the money, then perhaps they're not the right individual to be in a leadership role. So let's move on to our analytical phase. For laboratory or patient results, it's simply the performance, and I shouldn't say simply, it's very complex, but it's the performance of selected laboratory tests. During testing, there's transformations that happen. A chemical reaction happens in some laboratories. In some laboratories, we're growing bacteria or viruses. In some laboratories, we're replicating gene sequences. So there's a lot of transformation that happens during that analytical phase. If a potential supervisor has enough skills and knowledge to be put into a leadership position, we've probably identified some gaps in their knowledge and skills. And this analytical phase of leadership results or leadership development, this is our opportunity to continue that learning. I've got a couple of quotes here. So often, and those of us who've been in training for many years, we know that so many times people say, oh, so-and-so needs a class on, so-and-so needs a class on. And we tend to get tired of hearing that over and over, because in most cases at this point, it's not necessarily a class. Only 10% of our leadership training is really coursework. 20% is learned from a mentor or a boss. 70% is really on-the-job experiences where we're put in those challenging situations. Top-performing companies, limit their amount of classroom training. We call this process experiential learning. The individual discovers how they can handle challenges and sometimes adversity in that leadership role by their experiences. Leaders are not trained, they are transformed. Potential leaders already have education and training to fulfill the requirements of the job, but they may not demonstrate the vision and courage to act as leaders. So just like our specimens are being transformed during that analytical phase, our leaders are also being transformed in their skills and abilities. When Lincoln took office, he brought with him less experience than almost any other president before or since. Yet historians consider him to be one of the greatest presidents in U.S. history. What made him great was his ability to put his ego aside and learn from others. Lincoln knew he could learn a lot more from candid people than he could from those who tried to protect his feelings or who were afraid to speak frankly because he was in a position of power. So he's already in that position, but continued to learn and have that experiential training, during his presidency. A couple of other quotes from some influential leaders. Vince Lombardi says, "Leaders aren't born, they're made. And they're made just like anything else, through hard work. And that's the price we'll have to pay to achieve that goal or any goal." And if you're not familiar with Peter Drucker, he's considered the father of management. And I really like this quote. He says, "Half the leaders that I've met don't need to learn what to do, they need to learn what to stop. Perhaps we've learned things incorrectly over the years, and we need to distinguish, what are the important things that we need to continue, but what are some things that maybe we need to stop." Another interesting quote, "Experience is a hard teacher because she gives the test first and the lesson afterwards." This is by a gentleman, Vernon Sanders Law, and hadn't heard of the individual myself when found this quote, but he played 16 Major League Baseball seasons, starting in 1950 as a pitcher for the Pittsburgh Pirates, and in 1960 was a World Series champion. And how many times do we find that? We go through the test and then we get the lesson afterwards, particularly in leadership roles. Part of the analytical process is also mentoring. I don't know what your experience has been with mentoring. I did have a fairly negative experience with mentoring several years ago. It wasn't my fault. It wasn't the fault of the mentor. I think that neither one of us knew what was expected going into that situation. So I did ask a woman in the organization who was quite influential to be my mentor. So we met, about once a month. And at the time, I was pursuing my MBA degree. So we would talk about education, what was happening there. But pretty quickly, our discussion digressed into, how's the family, how's the kids, what's going on here, there. And we really didn't create a mentoring situation or a relationship. And so, obviously, I was not able to benefit from her experience and knowledge. Since then, I've learned some important steps when it comes to mentoring. When we think about mentoring, it's important to establish those expectations. And when I say expectations, it's the meeting frequency. Maybe you want to identify specific areas of expertise for a particular mentor. Maybe you'll have more than one mentor at different times. There may be some potential assignments that can add to the learning and to the experience. In addition to establishing very specific expectations, the mentee needs to take the lead. And what I mean by that is they need to set up the meetings. They need to, once that official arrangement has been made. The mentee needs to identify specific questions or topics for each discussion. I mentioned potential assignments, but actually I would recommend that assignments be made during this mentoring relationship. They don't need to be, very complicated assignments, but if you're working on communication or something like that, take an opportunity to write some additional communication messages, or maybe identify a particular individual that you've struggled with when it comes to communication. And what can you do with that individual to improve that situation? So it's really important to make the best of that mentoring situation. The mentee should report back on these assignments. Debrief with the mentor as to what went well, what could have been improved, what would the mentor recommend. That mentoring relationship is really a learning environment for the mentee. So as far as our analytical phase, when we look to leadership results, it's a lot of on-the-job or experiential learning, and it's mentoring from an experienced leader. As I mentioned, have more than one mentor at different times. Different leaders we look to for different strengths, and maybe we can gain things from one individual that we may not be able to from another. So let's look at our post-analytical phase. On the patient results side, typically what happens is recording, reporting, and interpreting. So how many of us love feedback? When we translate the post-analytical phase over to the leadership side, really feedback is a critical part of that post-analytical phase. So yes, not many of us particularly like to get feedback, but don't we get feedback every day, all day? Immediate feedback, isn't that what our youth love about video games? They've got immediate feedback. Isn't that what we love about microwaves and drive-through windows? It's maybe not so much feedback, but immediate satisfaction, immediate results. We love paying our bills online and checking our bank accounts online. Everything can be so immediate, and we can have that feedback right away. So when it comes to feedback in the workplace, is that so different? I had the opportunity over the last several months to meet with several groups of employees with regard to our engagement efforts. And really most of those departments, they wanted feedback. They wanted to know from their supervisor how they were doing. And unfortunately, not everyone had that from their specific or their direct supervisor. Part of that is the laboratory environment. It's very challenging when you have 24/7 shifts and so forth. But nonetheless, it's important to employees. Employees want feedback. Otherwise, how do we make any changes? So I want to share with you an old parable. There once lived a scorpion and a frog. And actually, before I get into this, when we talk about strengths of employees, I have to highlight that this is an individual in our education department who is one of our instructional designers, has great skills in that arena. And so I took advantage of some of his skills. So I hope that you appreciate his artwork. So there once lived a scorpion and a frog. The scorpion wanted to cross the pond, but being a scorpion, he couldn't swim. So he scuttled up to the frog and he asked, "Please, Mr. Frog, will you carry me across the pond on your back?" "I would," replied the frog, "but under the circumstances, I must refuse. You might sting me as I swim across." "Well, why would I do that?" asked the scorpion. "It's not in my interest to sting you, because you will die and then I will drown." Although the frog knew how lethal scorpions were, the logic proved quite persuasive. Perhaps, felt the frog, in this one instance, the scorpion would keep his tail in check. So the frog agreed. The scorpion climbed onto his back, and together they set off across the pond. Just as they reached the middle, the scorpion twitched his tail and stung the frog. Mortally wounded, the frog cried out, "Why did you sting me? It's not in your interest to sting me, because now I will die and you will drown." "I know," replied the scorpion as he sank into the pond, "but I am a scorpion. I have to sting you. It's in my nature." Just to follow up to that little parable, there's a couple of things that I find interesting that relates to. First of all, going back to our books about highlighting whether we have strengths or whether we focus on strengths or weaknesses, and we have certain talents that are ingrained in us That's what the scorpion's saying. That's who I am. That's what I had to do. But in addition, did the frog not get some immediate feedback here? And probably wasn't the best feedback that he's received, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So why do we shy away from feedback? We don't really like it, but we're afraid to have our feelings hurt. We're humans, and we have feelings, and we think, oh, but they said something to me, so they don't even like me. And when we think about feedback, it's not a matter of whether people like you or don't like you. It's trying to get some objective and constructive feedback. We don't want to look stupid in front of peers or coworkers, but we have a lot of fear. The challenge is to not fear feedback, but to fear its absence. As we mentioned, if we don't get some kind of feedback, how are we going to know what we need to change to improve and become a more successful leader? If you haven't heard of the book, The Gift of Feedback by Nigel Bristow, it's a pretty short read, and he focuses on 4 different types of feedback. First of all, silence. We have positive feedback, negative feedback, and specific feedback. This is something that is very enjoyable to do as a live exercise. And I'm going to try and talk through this, and I realize it's a little more difficult, but it's something that really brings the point across when it comes to talking to leaders about feedback. So what we like to do as an exercise is we wrap a small gift, have the group in the room. We ask for 4 volunteers, and they, of course, leave the room, and we have someone at the group hide the gift. And then we explain to the group that we're going to bring these individuals in one at a time, and they're going to experience different types of feedback. So our first individual, Bob, we're going to invite him back in. We've explained to the group that we're going to give his type of feedback is going to be silence. No matter what Bob asks, the response is silent. We invite Bob into the room. Bob says, "Hey, where's the gift?" Nothing. "Am I hot or cold?" Nothing. Have you experienced things like that in real life? We ask questions, we get nothing. Perhaps not in person, but we send, communications out and we never get a response. So we give him a few minutes and he may frantically look for the gift, but chances are Bob won't find the gift because he hasn't had any significant feedback. Bob gets to join the group, and we explain that the next type of feedback is going to be positive. And so we're going to invite Carol in, and no matter what she asks, we're going to give positive comments. Now you may be thinking, well, isn't positive feedback what we're supposed to do? But let me continue to illustrate this. So Carol comes in and Carol says, "Hey, where's the gift?" We say, "Carol, you look great today. I love their outfit." Carol says, "Am I hot or cold?" "Carol, you can do anything you put your mind to." And we continue with those positive reinforcements, but they really are not helpful in any way. Yeah, they feel good. They feel great. Carol's going to go away feeling very good, but she's not getting the desired outcome. So Carol joins our group, and we're going to invite, we'll call him John, to come in. And we're going to focus on negative feedback. John comes in the room, says, "Where's the gift?" "John, can't you do better than that?" "Am I hot or am I cold?" "John, you really need our help." And we continue that negative feedback. I'm sure we've all experienced all of these different types of feedback, and I'll share some specific examples here in a minute. What we're really looking for, and chances are, John's not going to find the gift unless he searches really hard, but it's going to be on his own because, again, he didn't have any help from the group. What we really want is specific feedback. It's objective. It's not emotional feedback. We want to take that emotion away from it, be objective. And so when we invite Sally to come in, we've instructed the group. She asks, where's the gift? And of course, they give very specific information. Well, it's down on the floor. Or she'll say, should I look in the drawers? And we'll say yes. And she's going to find that gift very quickly because of that very specific feedback. So here are some examples. A manager hands in a report to her director and waits for a month without receiving a reaction. The manager wonders, what did I do wrong? A supervisor becomes upset at an employee who consistently makes typing errors. Don't you know anything about the English language, he yells. It's amazing you ever finished high school. The manager slams a recently typed document on the employee's desk. Probably isn't about finishing high school or anything like that, but certainly there's no positive aspect to that feedback. An employee received praise from a supervisor during an annual evaluation. You're doing a great job, she's told. Keep up the good work. She leaves the office and she wonders, well, what exactly am I doing well? I will keep doing it, but I'm not sure what it is. I've had managers like that, and yes, it's positive, but it can also be very frustrating because you really don't know which direction you're supposed to be going. And so when we talk about feedback, I encourage this very specific feedback. So a supervisor tells an employee that they appreciate how detailed they are on the quarterly reports. He continues with, I like the way the data is compiled and organized into an easy-to-read format with section headers. I also like the color coding. That makes my job so much easier. I would, however, like you to use a sixth column to show the sales projections for each quarter. With the specifics given, the employee is not left to guess how they are doing on the quarterly report. And can you see how that really isn't an emotional response like our negative, slamming things down? So it takes that out of it, making that much more objective. Now, like I mentioned, we do get feedback a lot. Do we like the feedback that we get? Don't reject the gift of feedback, simply because you don't like or respect the giver, or because you suspect their motives. It may be more comfortable working with diplomats, but you learn a lot more from straight talkers. We had something similar to that in the quote from Abraham Lincoln. We work with all kinds of individuals, and there are people who try to, give that feedback very carefully, but will we really get the message? And there are some people who can't package the feedback very carefully, like our negative response there. Didn't you even finish high school or something like that? But is there a kernel, some kernel of, in that feedback, some piece that you can utilize? Now, we may have times that someone mentions things and really it's not going to be beneficial for you. But the idea is to not throw out the gift of the feedback just based on the presentation. And just add a humorous side to feedback. If someone tells you, you have ears like a donkey, pay no attention. But if two people tell you, buy yourself a saddle. And this is by a famous Yiddish author and playwright from the 19th century. Let me share with you one more tool that can actually either help with feedback or help in the assessment prior to an individual going into a leadership position. This exercise comes from an article that was called How to Play Your Strengths, and it was published in a special edition of the Harvard Business Review in January of 2005. The article discusses this exercise called the Reflective Best Self. And we use this tool in our leadership class it's an 8-week session that we start about 4 times a year. And this is an opportunity for people to do just like we've been talking about, to get some specific feedback. So often the feedback that we get is negative, and so taking this opportunity to hear something positive is always a benefit as well. In fact, science will tell us that we remember 4 negative memories to every positive memory. So what we ask is the individual takes a sheet of paper and lets them know that they're participating in our management class, and they're seeking some input on the strengths that they have as an individual. And we ask them to identify at least 4 individuals, but the more individuals that you solicit feedback from, the better opportunity you'll have to see themes in that feedback. But we ask them to do at least 4 individuals. And we ask them to identify. So and Cherie's sitting here, so if I were to ask Cherie, tell me one of my personal strengths, and I give her this sheet of paper, she can write something down, whether it's communication, my example, my whatever it might be. But then I'm also going to ask her for an example of when I've demonstrated that strength. It's really easy to say, oh, you're a good communicator, or you're a very nice person. But hearing an example of when people have seen you demonstrate this, bring that home to you a lot more. And here's just an example of what someone could write. So one of the greatest ways that you add value is that you stand for doing the right thing. For example, I think of a time that we were behind on a project for a major client and quality began to slip. You called a meeting and suggested we had a choice. We could either pull a C by satisfying the basic requirements, or we could pull an A by doing excellent work. You reminded us that we could contribute to a better outcome. In the end, we met our deadline and the client was very happy with the result. So that's what we're looking for, a specific example. And we asked them each individual to identify 2 personal strengths for the participant in the class. And I know this was kind of an interesting little clip art with the selfie there, which is really quite appropriate, because if you utilize this exercise, and like I say, the more people that you get information from, you can start to break that out into themes, which helps create a self-portrait. And it's not necessarily designed to be like a whole psychological cognitive profile, but it's definitely insight into information that you can use, and it's a guide for future action. And as she said, as you write this personal portrait, starting on a positive note, when I'm at my best, and compile all that information to create that portrait. In summary, feedback is our main post-analytical step for leadership results. The purpose of leader and leadership development is to provide continual improvement and to be able to promote within. Here's a great cartoon that came from the Harvard Business Review, and I realize you can't see the caption, but it says, "I hate that we never promote from within." And some of us find that, that can happen. My intent in taking this approach and comparing the phases of laboratory testing to the phases of leadership development is to speak the language of the laboratory. I suggested to someone just the other day that one way to succeed with leadership development in our organizations is to try and speak the language of the culture. And so that's what I've tried to do here. Just like we collect and process specimens, we define the expectations of leaders and assess the individuals for their leadership skills. We transform specimens during actual testing, and we transform leaders through experiential and continual learning. We interpret and report back to physicians the patient result, and we ask for and provide feedback to others to interpret our success as a leader. We expect accurate and timely patient results. We also expect results in our leadership development to move the organization forward and to engage our employees. Unfortunately, there isn't a one-size-fits-all development program. Healthcare organizations do not have to go out and have formal academies and corporate universities to start down the path of providing effective leadership development. I have found in our organization that sometimes you start small and you just start. And there have been a couple of programs that we've implemented that after a time they become part of the fabric of the organization. And pretty soon they're dependent on that, but all we did was just start. So you can start small and do things that can relate to the culture of your environment. I've enjoyed sharing this information with you today.